you.
See, the reason I did tell this story the other day. The reason you're here, apart from the fact that lots of people really like what you have to say and they like your thinking, is that we actually bumped into each other on a train station the other day, which sounds like a romantic encounter.
Well, I was saying it's a bit like Brief Encounter.
Yeah,
it
is.
Maybe we should have been looking sultry,
Absolutely.
with a kind of Dirk Bogarde effect in the background.
Indeed.
Carnforth Station.
Absolutely.
I was born only a few miles away.
That's
so.
good. But interesting, because we did work together years ago. I was about 11 at the old talk radio.
That's correct.
And you were doing
in the mid-90s.
And you were this. I think you did. Did you do a Saturday morning show? I think or something like that.
I did a Saturday show which migrated to Sunday before it migrated through the door.
That's right. That's the usual journey of radio.
The usual journey of radio.
That wonderful
yes.
plank that everybody at some point
that's
walks.
Right, yes, yes.
But I remember because when that station started, not dissimilar to what we do here, but there was a sort of a freedom about it. And you talk a lot about, we talk about cancel culture and this kind of stuff. But I mean, freedom of speech and the right to have opinions and say what you believe without offending X, Y, and Z is so on the agenda right now. You can hardly pick up a newspaper without one of those stories appearing somewhere. Today we learnt that Mary Poppins could be cancelled because it might be racist because of the soot scene where one of the dancers gets soot. It's funny, isn't it? No, it would be funny if it wasn't
Poppins.
So blackface
it's
Poppins.
Deranged.
Yes.
It's deranged. And if you go back to in my life, born in 45, going to university in the 60s, for me, everything was this kind of broadening of freedom. I was born in the 40s, I'm at school in the 50s, I'm at grammar school in the 60s. When you first got proper satire, that was the week that was. I pioneered satire in my grammar school, and I remember agonised discussions with the headmaster as to exactly what we couldn't say. And from that point of view, it was like a highway broadening out, liberating speech along with liberating everything else. And suddenly we've gone into violent reverse gear. I think it's terrifying, and it's been accelerated by COVID, and we're in a sort of, at the moment, it's very easy to sound alarmist, and I don't like doing so, but I think we do need to sound the alarm. There's a risk that we got a Chinese virus, and we will finish up with a Chinese society. There is this appetite to shut down. The moment somebody has got the right to stop you saying something because they might be hurt, because a little point of their very tender anatomy might be dented, this is insane. We have to have a robust public culture. This doesn't mean yelling insults. I've never yelled insults. I would never dream of doing so. But we should have the opportunity to have frank and free interchange. Democracy depends on it. Science depends on it. All knowledge and progress depends on it. Because there's a very simple point. All progress is made by heretics. It's by people who don't accept what they're told.
That's a great point. I mean, in terms of this oversensitivity, I mean, the Frankfurt School will be rubbing their hands saying, this is exactly how we planned it. But what happened? What is there a tipping point here, the sort of Gladwellian tipping point where suddenly we went from common sense to no sense at all? I mean, identity politics, which is something I loathe, and the idea that you feed everything through the prism of your identity, whether it's your class, your gender, your sexuality, whatever it happens to be. Your race. I mean, this is just anti-intellectual nonsense. And you would it's also a journey that never ends as well, because you can continue to do that forever. And will always end up.
It ends in a certain portion of your anatomy.
Well, there is that.
And disappearing up.
But where did it start? Where do you see that tipping point?
There's a long intellectual lineage of this stuff. The whole business of what's called postmodernism, the deliberate rejection of modernity, which the foundation of modernity is a thing called truth, a fact. Women have cervixes. They have a particular sort of a chromosome, and a man has a particular sort of chromosome, and you can't change that. In the Middle Ages, of course, they believed you could. They believed that when the priest uttered certain words, the bread and the wine transmuted transubstantiated into Christ's body and to Christ's blood. Well, I'm sorry, I think the idea of a trans woman is exactly the same. It's asking us to believe in a miracle. Now, so that's a long intellectual lineage, but I think it's combined with something else. There's a moment, I suppose it's really Diana's death, the moment at which the stiff upper lip breaks and we sort of disappear into blubbering sentimentality. The extraordinary shift of public discourse in the late 90s, and we can really see again, I referred to the broad stream of freedom, we can see another broadening stream, sentimentality, what I feel, my lived experience, the replacement of fact with feeling.
My truth.
My truth. I'm sorry, that is no basis for public discourse. That's no basis for a serious society. This ridiculous coinage, emotional intelligence. What the hell does it mean?
It's interesting that you mentioned the trans issue, because that's very much front and centre. And I think what I find fascinating is that it almost came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I mean, suddenly this debate was front and... Now, I would imagine as a libertarian, you would have no problem with somebody wants to call themselves a woman or a man. That wasn't the point you were making. You were making a slightly different point, that the idea that everybody else has to join in with what you would call a non-scientific fact is just simply bonkers.
Well, it's the idea that you can actually change something that can't be changed. You cannot change your sex. You can dress as you like. You can wear whatever clothes you want, you can slap on makeup, you can have prosthetic surgery, but sorry, you are merely, to say you're the equivalent of somebody in drag is cruel, but that is all you are.
But if somebody has had the surgery and gone to that stage and they live as a woman but they were born a man, it's okay to say, to treat that person as a woman.
Yes, but...
Because that would just be polite, wouldn't it?
It is a form of politeness, but it's a form of politeness which fundamentally challenges truth, and there's a very fine line between those two things. I also think that we are at profound danger of generalizing and popularizing, as one sees with particularly vulnerable teenagers and especially vulnerable teenage girls, something which is profoundly risky, which is profoundly contentious and profoundly dangerous. Again, it's a problem with liberalism. Once you have this notion, which you and I did, you call me a libertarian, I used to be. When I appeared on talk radio, I was a libertarian. I've had second thoughts, because there is a problem. If you have the view, we choose what we are. We come into the world as a free-thinking, self-organized individual. We make up our minds. We enter into contracts. We determine what we are. But you see, that isn't true, is it? Just think about it. Has there ever been a sillier statement? The beginning of Rousseau's The Social Contract. Man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains. Actually, Ian, we're not born free. We're born mewling, howling, and other unpleasant functions babies that have to be picked up, tended, washed, fed for months, for years. We are creations of other people and our society. And so liberalism is a profound untruth, the notion that we have this absolute right to self-determination, that society consists simply of this series of separate atoms all negotiating with each other. No, we don't. We belong to groups. We belong to nations. We belong to families. And
by instinct or by design or a little bit of both?
By fact, by simple fact. We belong by language. We belong by culture. We belong by education. And the moment we run away from that, we're lost. And this is what liberalism does. There's no reason for liberalism to stop, right? Once you decide we're going to change everything, The first time people tried doing that is called the French Revolution. You must know all about the French Revolution.
I remember the French
You
Revolution.
vaguely remember 1789
Indeed.
when push comes to shove, don't you? The French Revolution thought it could start time from scratch, literally. You reorganise the calendar. Isn't it boring that there are 7 days in the week and 24 hours in the day? Difficult. You want 10 of everything. So you have 10 hours in the day, you've 10 days in the week, you've got 10 months in the year. The calendar, of course, becomes deranged. The entire metric system. You try to start human experience from scratch. And where does it end? It ends in the terror. And it ends Robespierre with the man who'd masterminded it, with half his jaw shot away, lying on the table, about to be put under the tumbril to have his head cut off. That's where it ends. And the liberalism of the 60s has ended where we are now. It ends with identity culture, cancellation, and the absurd statements of Sir Keith Starmer, the leader of the opposition, that you mustn't say that only a woman has got a cervix. Now, I was referring to satire. Satire falls silent.
Well, satire is dead, really, isn't it?
Because you can't satirise this. It's madder.
That.
It's, reality is much, much madder.
I think it would be a very bad thing to say that. I think he said.
Well, what does that mean? You see, it's an emotional statement. It's a bad thing because, especially in the Labour Party conference, you're not supposed to say things like that. Somebody might be hurt.
There it is. We will talk some more with Dr. David Starkey after this. Dr. David Starkey is in the studio with us. I've just found out 2 really interesting things about David Starkey. One is there's an autobiography on the way.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about you as well is, and I genuinely didn't know this, I didn't realise your background was a very, very working class background. I didn't realise.
But a very odd working class. My parents were the even odder thing. They were working class Quakers, members of the Society of Friends. And it's that peculiar mixture of, my father was apprenticed at Platt Brothers in Oldham, that was then the world's largest manufacturer of cotton machinery as a tool maker. But he equally, absolutely solid working class. He becomes a foreman, exactly the kind of thing you did then. But equally, that appetite for education, for learning, for literacy. My mother was very star at school, though left at 13. My father wasn't. But then there's a whole process of something we've completely forgotten. Voluntary education, Sunday school. And then, of course, as an apprentice back in the 20s, you were at night school. Do you know what their exams were like? These are people who were training to be tool makers. They had 3-hour written exams from 7 at night till 10 at night when you'd been working from 8 o'clock in the morning.
Really?
Right?
And that was...
That was then.
Yeah.
That was then.
Did that inform then your kind of ethics as in terms of work, in terms of education,
yes,
in terms
I
of
was
what
determined to get out.
Were you determined to get? Yeah, you didn't want the Quaker lifestyle.
All of this business about you should be able to fulfil yourself in the place where you were born. I had a completely different ethos. I was bored stiff by Kendall. I had no interest whatever in fell walking.
You made up for it in your LSE early days, I understand.
No interest in fell walking in daffodils in Wordsworth. I
or
wanted
mint
the
cake.
City. I wanted. Oh, God help us, disgusting. I wanted something different. But you know what? Schools like mine, that Northern Grammar School, they were founded in the late Middle Ages to get clever boys out. That was the whole point.
That was the point of it.
You wanted to go to London, you wanted to go to Oxford, you wanted to go to Cambridge, you wanted to go to the bigger world. And this seems to me to be proper, sensible. You can only have so many sites of real quality. We're a tiny country.
Well, Boris Johnson's going to level it all up, David.
When did you last ever believe anything that Boris said? We were talking about fact. Fact and Boris have only got the remotest nodding acquaintance, don't they?
What about, let me bring you this spelling story. I love this.
Yes.
Spelling apparently doesn't matter. I mean, so you managed a very working class background, despite the educational values that were a big thread in that upbringing. You went to grammar school, you went to Oxbridge. I mean, that must have been incredible. I mean, that's a big journey, isn't it?
No,
at the
it
time.
wasn't. Nobody thought it was at the time. This is what's so silly, that when I was at Cambridge, I reckon 2/3 of people and more already were from state schools.
Seriously?
Of course.
That was then, right.
Because all sorts of schools like Manchester Grammar and Dulwich College were state schools. They were
Sure.
direct grant. It was comprehensivisation that forced this divide and forced schools like Manchester Grammar, Dulwich and whatever, to go private.
Sure.
I was in a world where nobody cared at Cambridge. I know there were colleges where it mattered. I was at a humble one. If I'd been at Trinity or at Magdalen, yes, which class you were, which school you'd been to would have mattered. I mean, my college was odd. There were people like Chris. Do you remember Chris Martin Jenkins, the cricketing commentator? Old, very old.
So you were at university with him?
We were exact contemporaries.
Fantastic.
And we were sort of on nodding terms, and not intimate friendship, but. Again, I think that we've got all this badly wrong, but let's go back to that spelling point.
Yeah, because that would have been unacceptable at Oxbridge.
That was completely unacceptable. And it seems to me that it should be unacceptable now. Writing has to be clear. Writing can... This notion that, I can understand what you say without quite understanding how you're saying it, that's gibberish. You can't. I remember vividly, I was chairman of the Board of Examiners in the University of London about 1990, and we had exactly this argument. And there was clearly a bright boy, who now I'm sure would have called dyslexic. And you could see through this bizarre fog of ill-written, misspelt, non-punctuated stuff, there was a mind. But could you really tell what he said? Now, of course, there was a campaign mounted by my colleagues at University College, determined to get this lad a first. They won the vote. I was chairman. I then forced a minute which said, for the first time, the University of London BA degree in history has awarded a first to an illiterate candidate.
And
it was minuted.
Do you know whether that candidate knew you'd said that about
No, you
them
wouldn't.
specifically?
I mean, this was minuted by the exam board. It was intended as a warning. I think it's a warning that was disregarded. But you see, there's something else, Ian. If you're actually to teach people, if you are to make sure that your students can punctuate and can spell and can construct properly argued paragraphs that are neatly structured with a link from the last paragraph to the next paragraph, do you know what? You've got to work. You've actually got to be a real teacher. You've to see the student. You've got to mark the work. You've got to return the work. When I tried to introduce, in my days at LSE, in the International History Department, when I tried to introduce the rule, do you know what? That you've actually got to see the student to return their work. There was a rebellion by my colleagues. The thought that you had to devote 10 minutes to a student was shocking.
Really?
Their minds were on higher things. They believed in research. We're completely confused.
Do you think some of this diluting then of, let's call it standards, feeds into where we began this conversation about where we're at in terms of the sort of very oversensitive, touchy-feely world?
There's some of that.
Is it all in the same ballpark?
Some of that, because again, the argument would be, isn't it wicked to correct the writing of somebody who is dyslexic? Answer, they shouldn't be doing a course that's based on literary presentation. But it's also something else. It's based on laziness. It's based on the idleness of many university teachers who simply don't see it as their job to teach. And of course, I'm afraid an earlier idleness on the whole, the product of state schools. Most public schools regarded as their job to do these things. Many state schools do and do a wonderful job. There are too many who don't.
Just finally, you've got a YouTube channel starting. I didn't know this. We didn't bring you in to promote this, but it's just by a happen chance you mentioned it to me during the break. So what's this? Is this kind of Starkey unleashed?
No.
To the digital world?
It's going to be called David Starkey Talks. I'm going to be primarily talking about history.
Yep.
I'm going to be trying to convey the same atmosphere in the talks, or I'll be doing them sitting down intimately, of what would have been one of the lectures that I gave when I was an academic when I used to go round and visit,
Sure.
museums, historical associations. So it'll be a freewheeling engagement of my mind on a topic. The one that I did last night, for example, was on the reinvention of the monarchy, our monarchy in 1917. When we do a complete retread. It was a German dynasty, and we suddenly turn it into an English family. We change the name. We invent the name Windsor. Do you know what? It was a result of market testing.
Is that right?
Yeah, of course they went round.
Went out and surveyed people.
Within an elite, admittedly.
Smith, Jones, or Windsor? Which one do you want?
Well, no, it was going to be. Let's get them right. Plantagenet, Tudor, Stuart, Fitzroy, whatever. But these things were tossed around.
Yeah.
Do you know what else they do in 1917? You completely stand the honours system on its head. We're talking about cancellation. Everybody wants to cancel the Order of the British Empire. The Order of the British Empire is the first order that's given to ordinary people and to women. And do you know where the inaugural investiture was held?
Go on.
Ibrox Park Football Stadium.
Well, what about that? What a great fact to finish on. YouTube, is it out now? Is it there now?
No, it'll be the end of the month.
End of the month. Just Google it, search it. David Starkey, good to see you, sir. Thank you.
Great pleasure.
We will speak very, very soon.